So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this lunchtime webinar on road safety, organised by the Transport Planning Society. My name is Ben Plowden, and I'll be your chair for today's webinar. Just a very quick word about myself. This subject is a subject very dear to my heart because in a former life I was the founding chief executive of Living Streets, the national NGO, which had a big focus on road safety. And then latterly, I spent nearly 20 years at Transport for London, where, amongst other things, I was responsible at various points for casualty reduction and the Vision Zero approach that London's taken around casualty reduction. So this is a subject very close to my heart, and I'm sure for all of you as well. Thank you very much for making the time to attend the webinar during a lunchtime, and thank you too to the panelists who will introduce shortly for their time in presenting. This is a subject that's been of public concern for many years. In fact, the Pedestrians Association, which was the predecessor to Living Streets, was founded in 1929 as the Pedestrians Association for Road Safety because of the concern back in the 1920s about the impact of the growing number of cars on pedestrian safety. So road safety and casualty reduction has been an issue of debate for at least 100 years, if not longer. The key, I think, contextual issue for today is the changes to the Highway Code back in 2021, which at long last gave a higher priority to the interests of pedestrians and cyclists in the kind of road user hierarchy. And that provides, I think, a very useful background to today's event. So what I'm going to do is ask each of our speakers to, of our illustrious speakers, to speak in turn. And I'll introduce them as they go. And then if you could save your question, obviously feel free to use the chat function as we go through the event. And if you have a question either for one of the speakers as we go through or for all of them as a panel, then please post it in the Q&A and we'll come back to that after the full presentations. Jonathan Flowers was meant to be joining us today. He's unfortunately been held up. I'm hoping he will be able to join us before the end of the seminar. But if not, obviously we'll just take questions to the other three panelists and presenters as we go through. So our first speaker today is David Davis, who has a long and illustrious career in sustainable transport, road safety and public sector scrutiny. He did a PhD in transport planning, which led to his taking up a job as a transport policy officer for Birmingham City Council. He then worked as a consultant in UK and overseas before forming his own company, David Davis Associates, which specialises in transport and sustainable transport. He then went to the Audit Commission in 2003, where he undertook transport and environment inspections and performance assessments of local authorities. And then in 2007, he went to work with the Transport Select Committee in the House of Commons, managing a series of inquiries into all aspects of transport policy and delivery. And since January 2013, he's been the Executive Director of the Parliamentary Advisory Committee on Transport Safety, which looks at safety right across transport, including obviously on the road network, which, David, presumably means this must be your 10th anniversary at PAC, so congratulations. Well done for that duration. So David's going to set us the context for road safety in the UK as a whole, which I think will provide a very helpful backdrop to the other presentations we'll then hear from the other speakers. David, over to you.
Ben, thank you very much and good to see you again. I will try to share my slides. So just get it to right. Can you see that? Is that showing fully?
Currently showing just the slides, David. I mean, in the slide, not in the full slide presentation.
All right, we have another go. Are you?
The slideshow from beginning.
Yeah. Right.
Perfect.
Good. Apologies, I'm more familiar with Teams and anyway. Yeah. So first of all, very pleased to be invited to talk today. As Ben said, I've been in and around transport planning, mostly on the environmental side, policy and connections with road safety for most of my career. And so I strongly believe in connections between road safety and the transport planning world. And I'm very pleased to have this opportunity, and I've attended previous PPS events and always really enjoyed them. So I'd like to give you a quick overview of the situation in the UK and point towards some of the areas where I think there are obvious connections between road safety and transport planning, which I think have not always, or recently, have not been as strong as they should be in my view, or in our view. So just to give you a picture, I'm talking about the UK, but I want to just start off with the global situation, if I may. So some figures from the World Health Authority, World Health Organization, I beg your pardon. Globally, some 1.3 million people die every year on the result of road traffic crashes. And that is the leading cause of death for children and young adults, 5 to 29 years of age. So and this is, I think, not nearly appreciated sufficiently. People think about malaria or other such diseases such as that. And in fact, road collisions, which we would say are largely preventable, are a far bigger source of death. And that's leaving out all the serious lifelong injury that can result as well. And, you know, very unfairly, 93% of this occurs on the roads in low and middle income countries. So although they have far fewer vehicles per head of population, the safety situation is much worse. And that amounts to something like 3% of their GDP. So the UN and WHO have actually elevated road safety to be to one of the global development goals, in fact, 2 of the global development goals relating to the development of cities and also to health. And so that has given it a much higher profile. But if you look to the UK, well, where did it all begin? The first person to die on the roads as a result of a road traffic collision was Mrs. Bridget Driscoll, who died at Crystal Palace in 1896. And the coroner said he hoped such a thing would never happen again. Well, it's sadly ironic now when you think that the number of deaths annually went up to almost 6,000 in the 40s. And although we've made progress since then, I'm afraid the coroner's hope was very far-fetched. Where's the UK on that international scale? Well, in 2021, based on the number of deaths per million population, the UK ranked 5th, and the European countries are largely the best performing, if that's the right term, performing in terms of road safety, which is good. I mean, the UK does have a good road safety record. There's no getting away from it. It's not good enough. And certainly even transport ministers admit that not everybody feels safe. And that is actually a new sort of emphasis, I think, in transport and road safety. The unfortunate thing about this statistic about UK being around about 5th is that it does allow our government to say, well, we've got some of the safest roads in the world, and is road safety a priority? And I'll come back to that later. But unfortunately, it has certainly not been given the priority over the last decade that we feel it deserves.
David, sorry to interrupt you. The audience can't actually see your slides moving on. Are they changing at your end?
They are at my end, yes. Okay, that's rather unfortunate.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay.
That's fine. We'll just make sure we're listening rather than watching. That's fine.
Well,
Thank you.
I mean, I'd like people to see them. Is that not updating?
No, it's not as a viewer, no.
Right, okay.
Maybe use that. If you use that format, that's probably fine. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, okay,
that's fine. We can see that. That's great.
Okay, well, I apologise for that.
That's okay. Thank you.
So, in terms of numbers, UK numbers, and I was saying that the government has rather sort of said, well, we're amongst the best in the world, so what's the problem? Well, there is a problem. There's a big problem still. You know, on average, some 33,000 people are killed or seriously injured each year on GB roads. It's dipped a bit during the pandemic, but that has been the last decade. And some 4,000 families need support as a result of some horrific life-changing event during the year. And these families' lives can be changed for years. And if we look at it financially, there's the official estimate from the Department of Transport is that the value of preventing those collisions is some 33 billion. And that doesn't take into account all sorts of things such as congestion. So it is huge. And I have heard it said, and I have to say, sometimes by certain sort of transport planning advocates, that things like air pollution are now a much bigger issue, and that accounts for far more deaths than road deaths, and so therefore, you know, that's a bigger issue. If you put it onto a comparable basis, the economic valuation for preventing road deaths is higher because I'm not playing down at all the importance of air pollution and improving air quality, but that is an area to which is primarily about premature deaths rather than these instantaneous deaths to young people in many cases on the roads. And if we just look at the immediate costs of the NHS, we're looking at nearly £1 billion a year. And when you think the Prime Minister made the NHS one of his 5 top priorities in his recent speech, then you can see the relevance of it to the government's agenda, one would think. And in terms of benefit cost ratios, which I'm sure TPS members will be well aware of, then road safety engineering comes out very well and much better than large road investments or even something like High Speed 2. So what has happened over the last decade? Well, in the words of the Department of Transport, the UK has plateaued. You can see that there has been a decline, a small decline, a more significant decline during the COVID period. But if you leave that aside, there's been a small decline over the last decade, which is in contrast to the much more satisfactory long-term trend that we experienced prior to the last decade, when casualties were going down much faster. And you can see from this slide, I hope, that in terms of progress over the last decade, whereas previously the slide I showed the UK at the top, in terms of progress over the last decade, we are near the bottom of the pile, just below Israel and just above Chile, which doesn't say very much, I don't think. So I think we've definitely taken our eye off the ball. And just who are the main sufferers of casualties? Well, it's mostly car occupants, because those are the people who travel most, that's fair to say. But also pedestrians and motorcyclists make up most of the other casualties. And if we're going to tackle road casualties and achieve the zero casualties, which is a goal of many local authorities, and that's where we really need to be aiming. Not exclusively, other road users too, but we have to address those groups too. Looking at the other way around, I mean, the issue of road danger reduction is another approach. Transport for London, as Ben knows, has focused on a road danger reduction approach. And this slide just shows the risks to other road users by distance travelled. And it does highlight the dangers, particularly from vans and light goods vehicles and HGVs, as one might expect. So this is not the people who are injured in the vehicle, it's the people that get injured by the vehicle. It's not attributing blame or responsibility or causation, but that's just a fact of physics. And if you put those two bits together, who gets injured in the vehicle and by the vehicle, then you can see that cars do come out as the dominant mode to which account for most death and injury. So PAC's focus, as the name suggests, is Parliament. We are trying to engage with parliamentarians to take this all very seriously. I mean, our foundation was 40 years ago when the founders of PAC pushed through the legislation to make seatbelt wearing compulsory. And on Tuesday next week, it will be 40 years since that came into effect. So I think you'll be noticing some publicity around seatbelt wearing next week. The Prime Minister's already given it a highlight, which was rather unfortunate, but we hope that won't work against us. And Our target, as possibly yours, is the road safety the roads ministers, Department for Transport ministers, and the new internationally supported approach to road safety is the so-called safe system approach, which tries to bring together safe road use, safe vehicles, safe speeds, safe roadsides, and post-collision response into an integrated approach. And a number of local authorities are setting up Vision Zero partnerships, which pull in all these different partners and approaches. If I can just blow our trumpet briefly, PACS has been working on a number of fronts, and I think one of the successes, so despite my dissatisfaction I mentioned earlier with the government's progress, the government has committed itself to establishing a road safety investigation branch, which we have those for air, for rail, and maritime, and all sorts of other things. So that's long overdue. The government has now started to reanalyse the statistics based on the road danger reduction approach. We hope there will be a road safety strategic framework published quite soon based on the safe system approach. And we've been influencing the government on things like e-scooter regulations, we hope, and we hope also on seatbelts. So it's old issues and new, as you can see. But as I mentioned at the beginning, what I'd really like to do is to encourage closer working between the road safety community and the transport planning community, because we in PACS absolutely recognise those other agendas: decarbonisation, active travel through gear change, and the impacts of road collisions on the NHS. So we're very keen to do that. We promote public transport because it's the safest mode of transport. We are keen to see active travel because of its health benefits, because of its environmental benefits, and because by and large it's benign to other road users. And then there are new challenges like e-scooters. We were rather unfashionable in saying we had some concerns about them when they were first announced in 2020 by Grant Shapps. I think some of our safety concerns have been borne out, but we are keen to see that new modes of transport, micromobility, play their part in decarbonisation as safely as possible. I think we are at a point of seeing some substantial change in working practices with gig working, much more delivery riders, new forms of micromobility servicing those, and there are some big challenges there, which again, local authorities, transport planners and so forth need to get together to combine to work on. So my message finally is just please, work with us. Very pleased to be on this lunchtime event, and be great to hear from you.
David, thank you very much indeed. Really helpful context setting, and particularly drawing attention to the fact that both globally, but even in the UK, we're still seeing a sort of stubbornly high level of death and injury on the road. Just a question from me. It's a difficult question to answer simply, but what do you think is the reason for that? You've been sort of inside the government system as an auditor and as an academic and as a consultant, but also working with the committee. What is it you think that's preventing us tackling this preventable problem, which is causing still such significant financial, economic, and social costs? If you had to explain why that is, what would you say?
It's a question I do ask, and I would like to have the minister in a room and say, come on, fess up. Honestly, I think there's possibly two things. One is a sense of complacency. We've been there, done road safety, 40 years in seatbelt legislation. What's the issue? And secondly, I think there is still a fear of the so-called motoring lobby. So anything with speed cameras, fines, and so forth. Despite the fact that there's the AA surveys show the strong support for that, does cause fears in certain political advisors.
Okay. And a second question for me, if you had a minister in front of you, and I'm sure you have on many occasions, what 2 or 3 things would you say need to be changed in order to bring down those stubbornly high KSI data? What are the top priorities? If you could get it done, what are the top 2 or 3 things you'd want to happen?
Well, I'd like them to implement a lot of the stuff that they've been working on over the last few years. So, let's have a national road safety strategy. They're talking about a framework, and it should have targets. It should have performance indicators in it. Almost every other country in Europe has it. And I think, well, that doesn't deliver the results on its own, but that is a real gap, and it holds back other stakeholders. I would say, publish the results of the roads policing review, which has been going on. There's been a whole string of pieces of work on that, and the key bit there is to make roads policing a national strategic priority. So all police forces will be required to collaborate with it. And then I would say, to be honest, there's a lot of things there. I'm sure some people will be very keen on things like 20-mile-an-hour speed limits as a default. And I think as long as that's implemented effectively, then that in urban areas is a high priority. Similarly on rural roads, more fatalities occur on rural roads, and a review of national speed limits in rural roads will be a priority too.
Brilliant. And then I'll just very quickly take one question from the Q&A from Laurie about intelligent speed assistance, which apparently has been fitted to the scooters in the e-scooter trial in Southampton. Laurie's question is, do you have a view for when ISA might be mandatory for all vehicles? It's a technology you can basically put into vehicles and make them observe the speed. And what's your sense about where we might be?
Well, thanks for that question. I wasn't. So one of our absolute top priorities in terms of policy terms is adopt what's known as the General Safety Regulation, which the European Union was developing. The UK was developing it right up until the month we left the European Union and endorsing it. But now we seem to be going through this Brexit benefits exercise, and we have refused to adopt it. And one of the 50 measures in that General Safety Regulation is ISA, Intelligent Speed Assistance. It's not mandatory. You can make it mandatory. It is assistance. It is, it advises you if you're exceeding the speed limit, but even that has been shown to be beneficial. So that's part of it, yeah.
Brilliant. David, thank you very much indeed. There'll be a chance for further questions and comment later in the session. Thank you very much indeed, David. So our next speaker is Teresa Ciano, who has over 17 years, or I would say nearly 20 years experience in road safety and enforcement, working in Wales. And since 2017, Teresa's been the partnership manager for Go Safe, which is the Wales Road Safety Casualty Partnership. Her team delivers strategic planning, communications and marketing, as well as policy writing and compliance. And she also oversees 4 operational police units under the Go Safe partnership. She's also a member of the PACS board, so obviously works closely with David, and is going to talk to us today about Operation Snap, which is an initiative in Wales looking at speed enforcement. Teresa, over to you, and thank you very much for your time.
That's great. Thanks very much, Ben. Okay, so just get the presentation up. Is that visible for everybody?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, okay, great. So yeah, thanks very much. So yeah, as Ben says, I'm the partnership manager for Go Safe. We're a partnership with the 22 local authorities in Wales, the Welsh Government and the 4 Welsh police forces. And our strategic aim is to make Welsh roads safer through engineering, education and enforcement. And the way we look to achieve that is by a continued reduction in the number of people killed and seriously injured on Welsh roads, with the ultimate goal of no fatalities in the future. But today I'm going to speak about a small part of the work that Go Safe does in Wales, and that's about Operation Snap. Sometimes I feel like I've done every conference in the country on Operation Snap, but I appreciate that some of you won't have heard about it. So Operation Snap allows the members of the public to report motoring offences to the police, and that can be captured on dash cam, helmet cams, if you've got a camera fitted to your bike on the handlebars or on the seat, and we've even had people standing at the side of the road taking photos on their phone or using CCTV or Ring doorbells, things like that. So just to give an overview of the timeline of Operation Snap, we started a trial just in one police force in 2016. It was the idea of one of the Go Safe sergeants who said, you know, we take images of speeding offences daily and we process them. Why can't we do it from reports from the public? And we just wanted to test that out, test the legal process, obviously got Crown Prosecution Service advice, checked our policies and procedures and so on. That worked very well. And in 2017, I was given the go-ahead to be able to roll it out across the rest of Wales, and we were improving the way we were receiving submissions all the way through. So we've got a secure web form, so it's designed to be as friendly as possible for the members of the public, and then just sorting out the back office technology and so on. In 2018 then, we were featured in the DfT as a case study for cycling and walking investment as an example of something that can help vulnerable road users. In 2020, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary Fire and Rescue Services said that all forces in England and Wales should adopt Operation SNAP or an equivalent. And in 2021, we just changed our processes so that in line with the Witness Charter, we can give updates to members of the public. One thing I will say, as it is with anything that you start from scratch, you keep on learning. We've got a continuous improvement process in Wales, so we make sure that our policies and our processes are up to date with latest advice, and that we're continuing to develop what we do. So why did we bother in the first place? So this is the old process. So if you were a member of the public and you saw a witness and you witnessed a motoring offence, if you didn't have an independent witness to corroborate, but you did capture it on media, this was what would happen. I won't go through it point by point, but it does illustrate how complicated it was, you know, and it involved officers going to a home often, viewing the footage, sometimes seizing it, trying to copy it. And we worked out through that, the 28 steps. It took an average of 16 hours for a constable to deal with it. And that is if there wasn't a priority call on the day. So there was a disparity of service across the police forces. Now, we're in a modern age. You know, the fact that we can't report something online to the police 24/7 would be an anomaly. And you can do a lot through force websites now. But what this does, which the force websites don't allow you to do, is crucially upload that media footage at the same time. So the theory, when I had to go to my board and ask for permission to roll this out and to use our money to do it, part of the reason why was the Cambridge University study into body-worn video. And what that was the perception of being recorded and would people essentially change their behaviour. So when police introduced body-worn video, complaints against police officers fell by 93%. And that was just in 12 months compared to the year before. So Dr. Ariel is the scientist involved, and he was based at the Cambridge Institute of Criminology, said, "I can't think of any other single intervention in the history of policing that dramatically changed the way that officers behave, the way that suspects behave, and the way they interact with each other. Once the public are aware they're being recorded, once they know that everything they do is caught on tape, they undoubtedly change their behaviour because they don't want to get into trouble." And we applied that to Operation SNAP. So rather than it being a request to report submissions, first of all, it was designed to say, if you want to report something to us, we will deal with it. And that was an improvement on what we had before. But also it's around the people that are driving around to think, well, could I be reported for this? And we see daily on the roads, you know, whatever mode of transport we're using, so injudicious actions, you know, somebody not quite driving in a way we think is fair and reasonable. And the fact that we can now report that and do that is important. But just imagine if you were being recorded or you thought you were being recorded, would you change your behaviour? And ultimately, that's what we want to do. What we say is that with Operation SNAP, you know, there's lots of reports about police numbers, but the police can't be everywhere. With Operation SNAP, they can be anywhere. And we apply that then to the decision makers who review the footage. And what we say to them is, if you were in a patrol car behind this person, what action would you take in terms of prosecution? So it's the same principle in terms of just imagine you're on the road as a constable, and what would you do? So the types of reports that we get fit in with the Llwybr Newydd, which is the Welsh Government Transport Strategy, and it's around walking and cycling, prevalence of public transport, and the move away from car being king. So most of the offences that we get reported are from vulnerable road users. It's just really important then that we can support Welsh Government aims through Operation Snap. And of course, this supports the 2022 Highway Code changes as well. So just to go back to the driver theory as well, this is literally a scan from Contribute Factors form from Stats 19, and I was going through and just thinking, what in Wales causes our collisions? What causes people to die? And where somebody had made, I would call it an injudicious action, but an error, you know, could be on purpose or by accident, that resulted in a fatality. When we run through doing the business case, we looked at around 42% of fatalities in Wales involve somebody making a mistake, either intentional or unintentional. And that means we could potentially save 40 people a year, and that's just if they change their behaviours. That's really what we're all about. Just to give you an overview of the web form, and there is a link at the end, but there's a standard pro forma. What that does for us though is it will back populate to a non-editable witness statement, a section 9 witness statement, which is something we need to be able to prosecute an offence. We make it mandatory for the person to read our FAQ or to say that they've read their FAQ. Obviously the responsibility is on the submitter there. And then they upload their footage, and that media footage forms a corroboration. So that is somebody saying, I, Teresa Chano, saw this offence on this day, date, time, application, and look, here's the evidence. And that's that independent corroboration. And that's very critical in terms of allowing us to prosecute those. The Operation Snap decision makers, they'll get an email notification to say somebody's made a submission. The member of the public will have a confirmation email with the reference number on. Just in terms of the team that we've got 5 civilian decision makers in Wales. They've got delegated authority from the chief constables to run the prosecutions, and they will decide upon the disposal options if there is an offence made out. So there could be a conditional offer of fixed penalty, a driver education course if that's applicable. They can have a driver warning, or they could proceed to court, and of course that depends on the offence. We do record where we haven't taken further action. We split that into 2 categories. 1, because there was no offence made out, and 2, if there were insufficient details. So for example, if the camera wasn't quite trained to see the registration mark, if it's out of visibility, we can't prosecute on those. So just in terms of the updates for the members of the public, they can put their reference number and email address in there, and we'll tell them what's happened. So you can just see in that example, we've said action taken, positive action. We don't tell them exactly which one because we're not able to, but we do tell them that their case has gone forward, and that's in line with the witness charter for the police. So how many have we had? You can see in 2017, there's a little asterisk there because we only run it in November and December. We had 216, and we're nudging close to 6,877 last year. We have seasonal peaks and troughs. It's busier in the summer. Not surprising, we get a lot of reports of close passing cyclists, and that sort of is a relevant link really. And that's what it looks like. Obviously, that's not every offence that we deal with, but you can see the level of prosecutions that we have last year and just an increase in the summer there. Just to say as well, all of our Operation Snap staff are trained to work out the speed of drivers. We don't routinely use Snap for speeding, but what we do is provide evidence of significant driver behaviour. So if somebody perhaps is a bit careless and driving too close and we thought, that looks fast, and you can tell from footage, then we will work out the speed and just use that maybe to bump up the seriousness and potentially provide some more information for magistrates during sentencing as well. So what do we do with the data? This is just an example from Dyfed-Powys Police. Our systems are not quite sophisticated enough to allow the 4 to integrate through Power BI yet, but this is through Power BI. So Dyfed-Powys Police will plot all of our Snap collisions, Snap reported incidents, no collisions on here as yet, albeit we will be overlaying these. And what that allows us to do is to zoom in on certain problem profiles, certain roads. So for example, I've zoomed in here on the A470, and these are our close passes there, and it just gives us that information that we can either give to the local authority or our roads policing colleagues, just to say we think we've got a bit of a problem here, what should we do collectively in a partnership approach. So just on this example here, this is, we have something called Snapped, which is on the GoSafe website, and we change the videos every 2 to 3 weeks. And what that's designed to do is, I think in road safety for a long time, we've said, you know, drive safely or you could be in a collision. But what Snapped allows us to do is show some poor driving, which hasn't necessarily resulted in a collision, but has resulted in a prosecution. And what we're trying to do is start to talk to motorists more around, look, maybe you didn't cause a collision. And I think, you know, there's lots of behavioural insight into drivers believing a certain standard of behaviour. And of course, collisions sometimes, you know, you could get away with something 9 times out of 10, and it's on the 10th time it has serious consequences. But I just wanted, you can go and have a look on our website. I just wanted to show you an example of why the video is so useful for us in terms of prosecuting. Great, so quite fortunate that that wasn't one with a lot of swearing on it. But that parent and child were cycling along Ocean Way, Cardiff. That yellow van overtook them without giving due care and attention to the safety of them both. Initially, we offered them an education course, but they didn't want to accept it, so we went to court with them. They were found guilty, and the motorist was given £811 fine, 6 penalty points on their licence. So that's just a really useful example of the effectiveness of a submission where we're able to get prosecution. And that's just what the website looks like. So we try and mix it up across the different police force areas, give different examples of types of offences, but they really do add value, I think, in terms of explaining why it's useful. And that's it. There's contact details there, but of course, happy to answer any questions at any point.
Rita, that's brilliant. Really, really interesting and inspiring, and sort of showing the power of using new technology to help the police and law enforcement agencies to sort of do their job when they're obviously very constrained. So we've got a question which actually occurred to me as well in the Q&A from Jan Claire McNeil, which is, what are the GDPR implications of Operation Snap? How do you deal with issues around data security and sort of personal data? Is that, I'm sure that's managed, but how is that managed in the process?
So the in terms of making the submissions, the information security is quite tight around the web form and the back office. So the information is made by a member of the public straight to the police. That's GDPR compliant. How we look at and manage the data is, because it's then ingested into police force systems, comes under those rules. In terms of Snapped and publicising that information on the website, you'd see that we redact the registrations, things like that. And we also only put things on Operation Snap that have been to court, or that are in the public domain. So that's that, Jan. I'm not sure if that's what specifically we're interested in, but safe to say it's been through the lawyers' data protection teams for all 4 forces several times. We've got data processing contracts for the third party that does our Operation Snap hosting and things like that.
Brilliant, thank you. And then just a question from me. Fantastic, you've got that kind of data mapping against the road network. To what extent have you been able to determine the effect that Snap's had on your overall casualty records, either in a location or more generally across the network? Has it been possible to kind of trace the effect on outcomes?
It hasn't as yet, and I think there's a couple of reasons. One, while we're going through the continued improvement process, we haven't gone out to the public en masse and said, you know, this is how you can report it, because of course this isn't us asking the public to do the job for us. This is dealing with what the public want to report to us. So there's quite a distinct difference there in how we've approached it. However, I think it is quite difficult sometimes to get a video pointing at the right place at the right time as an incident occurs. And of course, there's only a certain member of the public with that equipment on them. Dash cams are expensive, or they can be proportionally. But I think as my colleagues in England are catching up, and I think there's very few forces without it now, and Police Scotland haven't got it, I know that. We're now starting to get into that behavioural norm where more people are aware of it, and you know, the possibility of being reported. So as time comes on, the number of submissions is going up. Not, I think, because there's more people committing the offence, but because more people are aware of it and can deal with it. So, you know, David referred to the road safety strategy, policing review. The more we tell people that this is something that can happen, the more I think the compliance will improve. I don't think we'll ever, unfortunately, get the correct attribution. Hopefully overall we will see a reduction in casualties, and of course, you know, with COVID we saw skewed collision profiles anyway, because there were fewer people on the road. So I think we certainly see this as a long-term added value option. The number of offences we can deal with, if we think we've got a team of 5, we're dealing with nearly 7,000 offences a year. That's pretty fair. I think somebody's asking TV adverts, high record, close paths, and so on. Okay. You know, I think just to on a totally different topic, the default speed limit in Wales changed to 20 in September, and there is a national campaign coming through in March. And I think those wide-scale, high-profile, government-backed, consistent campaigns are really useful in just sort of changing that behaviour. But they need to be sustainable. We don't hear a message once and take it on, unfortunately.
Brilliant. Teresa, thank you so much. Really, really inspiring, and great to hear that it's now starting to roll out across the rest of the UK, which is obviously crucial. So I'm sure we'll come back to Snap in the Q&A at the end of the session, but let's move on now to our next speaker, who's Nick O'Donnell. Nick is the Assistant Director for Traffic and Engineering across the joint operations across Richmond and Wandsworth councils in London. He has over 25 years of experience in both the public and private sectors, and has an extensive portfolio of successful projects delivered, including the Docklands Light Railway extension to Woolwich, borough-wide LED and 20-mile rollout in Richmond and Wandsworth, and the Nine Elms master plan. So, Nick, I think you're going to talk about some topics sort of similar to Teresa around speed enforcement, particularly around sort of keeping speed at 20. So, Nick, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ben. I haven't got any slides, so I'm going to keep this relatively short and punchy. I could potentially share my notes. We'll see how we go. But just a bit of background. So, like many boroughs, within the context of Wandsworth in this particular case, we've had a history of historical speed exceedances on our roads, lots of residential roads where cars' average speeds have been high, lots of complaints from residents and a desire to see action around that. And like a number of boroughs in London, we started off with a borough-wide 20-mile-an-hour rollout, which was done a couple of years ago. And that was relatively successful in bringing speeds down, bringing accidents down, and providing significant improvements to a number of areas. However, there were a number of roads that, despite having engineering measures and 20-mile-an-hour rollout, were still showing very high speed exceedances above 20 mile an hour. We did further engineering measures and reviews. In some cases, the cost of the engineering measures was such that it was getting to kind of £1 million plus on certain roads where we just felt it was unaffordable or couldn't be justified. And then we looked specifically at a couple of roads in our borough, so Wimbledon Park Road and Priory Lane, and we did a quick survey. So over a 52-day period, we had nearly 60,000 offences of vehicles going over 24 miles per hour and above, which works out at over 1,000 offences a day, or if you want to put it into other terms, nearly 400,000 a year. So it was very clear from just those two roads that there was a serious problem that still existed on our roads. We feel that whilst the police do a very good job in trying to support speed enforcement, it's impossible for them to enforce all over the borough. And we do feel there's a role for local authorities to support and complement that activity. And that led us to look at the legislation that's out there, the current legislation, not anything new, and looking at, in particular, the London Local Authorities and Transport for London Act 2003, along with the Road Traffic Regulation Act 1984. Within that, there are specific powers that allow a local authority to issue penalty charge notices for contravening a prescribed order. And we use that under an experimental traffic order, and I stress experimental because this can't be done on a permanent basis, to basically trial two roads, as mentioned, for a 20-mile-an-hour speed enforcement trial. Before we started that, we did two separate legal reviews to ensure that we weren't balmy, and that they stood the ground legally, which they did. And we did our own sort of judicial reviews and detailed reviews of kind of how we felt the law stood against that. And we felt that they were appropriate and they were apt and that the existing powers did stand. So we proceeded forward and we placed an experimental traffic order, which went live in December 2021. And we then spoke, obviously speaking into other stakeholders as well. We advertised the fact those two roads were going to have Home Office approved speed cameras on them. But we paused the project around summer 2022. Small little thing around local elections where people got a bit twitchy and a bit nervous. So we put it all on hold whilst those concluded. In the case of Wandsworth, we happened to switch authorities from Conservative to Labour, but there was still support to continue with the pilot. So we picked up the reins last autumn. We had the cameras installed on site, and then we started going live. And our preference at the start was very much to focus on warning notices for drivers who exceeded 24 miles per hour in this particular case, as we set down. We felt it was appropriate to take that route. It wasn't about income, it was about trying to reduce speeds and road danger. And in the 2 months towards the end of the year, in November and December, across the two roads, we issued 2,500 warning notices, which gives you an idea of the scale of exceedance of speeds just on those roads, and the fact that people were getting that number in the hope that that would inform their decision making and inform their driver behaviour. We also did some speed surveys to see if there was any effect in relation to the cameras being there, and the early results after a month of them being there was that there was a 1 mile per hour reduction in speeds, and a number of vehicles travelling over 25 miles per hour dropped from 13% to 6.6% on the trial roads. So there were some very immediate impacts from the cameras being there. At this stage and at this moment in time, we feel that the objectives of reducing the road danger and the speeds are being met. The current order runs until June of this year, so the 18 months of an experimental traffic order before it expires. We can't make them permanent, but we are talking to the Metropolitan Police and TfL and the DFT about what we can do. Our preference has always been to try and find a kind of hybrid approach between us and the various stakeholders to bring forward a kind of hybrid model that could make cameras permanent and could lead to local authorities having a more active role in speed enforcement. This is very much our take and our approach to try and open the door and open the conversation towards that. Ideally, I'd love to see something like a white paper that picks up on its more permanent powers, but at least we've done it to, in effect, stimulate the conversation and demonstrate that local authorities can play their role. That role could also, in theory, be on things like running speed awareness courses in the future, because local authorities, again, have the powers to do that, or playing another role within potential trials. But this has got us going in the right direction so far. So that's just a quick summary from my side. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you very much. So people on the call may be surprised who aren't familiar with the sort of TRO legislation to hear that if this is having such a demonstrable positive effect, why you can't make that change permanent. Just explain for the non-highway law experts what is it about the TRO process if it's showing these benefits, why you can't install that process permanently.
Yeah, it's the ways the existing powers are written and set out means we can only follow an ETO, an experimental traffic order route, and it doesn't give us the legislation, the powers. With the way it's written within the sections of the Act, it doesn't allow us that approach. So it's basically allows you to test, but not to make permanent.
Right, which seems, I mean, to a layperson, seems slightly perverse. I mean,
agree.
And to what extent do you think there's scope? I mean, that obviously would require a change in primary legislation. I mean, to what extent, as local authorities like want to start these sorts of experiments successfully, is there scope for change in the primary legislation? Do you think that's a meaningful option or not?
Well, I think we wanted to prove the case that A, there's a very high exceedance number, which we have. B, that an approach like this can provide demonstrable benefits, which it has again in the early stages, and that there are models out there that can be done to work around it. So we hope that we're giving the early footings towards some kind of legislation being brought forward in the future.
Great. And then you mentioned clearly, also we heard from Teresa about sort of constraints on police resources. You mentioned kind of working now with the Metropolitan Police on sort of taking that for what might be the outcome of that conversation, given they've got a lot of other priorities and you know, scarce resources and tighter budgets. What might that working partnership look like?
We've got a series of meetings with them that have been ongoing. We've got another one on Thursday, as it happens. But from my perspective, there are different ways this could be done. So, for example, there's a difference between civil and criminal enforcement measures. So it could be that we deal with the speed exceedances between 24, 29 mile an hour, and the police deal with the higher exceedances. There are models there that suggest that we could assist with some of the rollout and infrastructure and income split from that in terms of how it works, because there are ways that we can look at running the speed awareness courses to assist in the process. So there are probably 3 or 4 different models out there that we feel could be adapted for us to be a complementary partner. This is not about replacing existing enforcement activity. It's not there. It doesn't exist on residential roads to an extent we want. And we're saying, look, carry on focusing on the main roads, which is where you've been most of the time with the 20 mile an hour enforcement and 30 mile an hour enforcement. Let us complement that and give you the extra supporting arms you need to keep going. Brilliant.
Thank you very much. So people listening to the presentations, obviously, please feel free to put questions in the Q&A channel for after the 4 speakers. But Nick, thank you very much indeed. So our final speaker today, I'm delighted to say that Jonathan Flower has been able to join us. Welcome, Jonathan. Jonathan is a transport planner and researcher at the Centre for Transport and Society at the University of West England in Bristol. He's a board member of the TPS, which is where I know him from, and he's looking to underpin transport practice with academic research in order to inform his students of their career opportunities in transport. Your current research portfolio or project focus has a road safety concentration, and it includes projects like bus safety in Nepal and behaviour in proximity to automated vehicles. And I think, Jonathan, you're going to talk to us today about issues arising from some research you've done into side entry or side junction design. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Great.
Good. So yes, so I happened to start life in Wandsworth. I married in Wales and now work across the Severn, as Ben said, in Bristol, where I work for UE. So following in the wake of Nick and Teresa, in this last part of the webinar, I'd like to share some of the findings from 2 recent studies that we've conducted here at the University of the West of England on priority junction design. Now, considering the road safety of street users, we soon realised that although all users have roles and responsibilities, the burden of that responsibility is not equally shared, and perhaps it shouldn't be. This picture here was a satirical view published in Punch magazine back in 1927, when they what they termed motocracy. You may have seen in the press in the last week, some of my colleagues here at the University of the West of England have called motor normativity, what you could say a taking for granted the dominant role of motor vehicles on streets. And in this short bit of the presentation, it looks at road safety from the perspective of making the streets safe for all users, especially those not in motor vehicles. Now, as Teresa mentioned, there were significant changes made in the Highway Code a year ago, back in January 22, and this included the concept of a hierarchy of road users that stated that those in charge of vehicles that can cause the greatest harm in the event of a collision bear the greatest responsibility to take care and reduce the danger they pose to others. And as you can see on the screen, it provided much needed clarity on the rules on turning into and out of the side road. They included when people are crossing or waiting to cross a junction, other traffic should give way. And when people cycling are going straight ahead of the junction, they have priority over traffic waiting to turn into or out of a side road. And finally, if people have started crossing and traffic wants to turn into the road, then people crossing have priority and the traffic should give way. It also introduced as you see in the picture at the bottom right hand corner, something called a parallel crossing. And parallel crossings are similar to zebra crossings, but include a cycle route alongside the black and white stripes. And the highway code changes there said that people driving, riding a motorcycle or cycling must give way to people on a zebra crossing, and people walking and cycling on a parallel crossing. Now, going back to 2020, something called the Local Transport Note 120 was introduced, and that was also called Cycle Infrastructure Design, and it included this diagram, which links to the two pieces of research I'm going to talk about. It provides 8 typologies for priority crossings. The first 5, T1 to T5, it calls marked priority. The second 3, T6 to T8, it calls design priority. So the marked priority are where priority is given to people crossing on foot or on cycle over vehicles turning in and out of the side road by use of road markings and road signs. And design priority is giving priority for people crossing on foot or cycle over people turning in and out of the side road by design. And the two first, T1 and T2, are using that parallel crossing that I mentioned earlier. Another way of looking at this is also by the level of setback of the cycle track. So the first column, T1 to T6, the cycle track is fully set back from the main carriageway. In T2 to T7, the cycle track is partially set back. That's less than the car's length from the main carriageway, and into the final column, there is no setback. The cycle track is aligned with the main carriageway. So in our first study, we were looking at priority by design, and this was done in collaboration with Sustrans and Transport Scotland. And as part of the study, we undertook observational studies. We looked at 6 sites across the UK where we put up video cameras and had video observations for a period of time, looking at design priority crossings. We looked at the collision records for that site and a 100-meter radius around that site. We conducted focus groups with various users about those sites, and we also conducted key involvement interviews with consultants and local authority officers relating to those sites. And so these were looking at design priority, the T6 to T8 typology. In fact, we didn't find any T6s fully set back cycle tracks, so they were all concentrated on T7s and T8s, where partial setback and no setback, and you can see some of the examples from the study in the photos at the bottom. In terms of the results, it's worth pointing out on this table and subsequent tables that as priority was granted to people crossing, we looked from their perspective. So when the tables talk about yields, it shows yields by people crossing on foot or cycle. They're yielding to people turning in and out of the side road. Which may be the opposite way around to the way you may conventionally consider yields. So looking at the 10 design priority sites, just looking at those highlighted figures at the bottom, across the days of our observation across the 10 sites, overall we saw that in 89.7% of cases, when a person was crossing on foot or cycle at the same time that a vehicle was turning in or out of the side road, that person didn't yield, and they were able to cross, and the vehicle turning in or out gave way. In 1.6% of cases, there was a voluntary yield by the person crossing, so that by some gesture or some means, they indicated to the person turning in or out of the side road that they could proceed, and they voluntarily allowed those people to turn in or out. And in 8.7% of the cases with design priority, the vehicle turning in and out forced the person crossing to yield. In the second study, we looked at marked priority. This was priority crossings given by either road markings or road signs or a combination of the two. Similar methodologies. This one was done with the Road Safety Trust. We had observational sites across the country, looking at the different forms of marked priority. We set up video cameras there and had video observations for a period of time. For this study, we also had control sites, which were conventional side road crossings where no priority was given, either marked or designed for the people crossing on foot and cycle. Again, we looked at the collision data available for the site and 100 meters around, and we also conducted focus groups around these sites with various users. This is an example of the parallel crossings that I mentioned, an example of a T1, a fully set back on the left in Bradford, and an example in Birmingham of a partially set back one on the right. And these are examples of the other forms of marked priority. Fully set back on the left, partially set back in the middle, and no setback on the right. And looking at the results here, we can see for marked priority and in comparison with the control sites that in this case, across all of the marked priority sites, 73.2% of the occasions when people were crossing on foot or cycle at the same time that a person was turning, they didn't need to yield. They continued, and the turning vehicle gave way. In 3.3% of cases, there was a voluntary yield, and in 23.4% of cases, the turning vehicle forced the crossing pedestrian or cyclist to yield. Compared with the control sites, the number of yields, the number of no yields dropped to 43.3%. So 43.3% of occasions when people crossing didn't yield to the turning vehicle. In 45.8% of the cases, they voluntarily yielded to the turning vehicle, and in 10.9% of cases, they were forced to yield. So just looking at this a slightly different way, in a bit more detail, there was a difference regarding whether the vehicle was turning in or out of the side road. We can see that for marked priority junctions, when the vehicle was turning out left and out right, there were 24.8% and 13% of yields respectively, and for design priority that dropped significantly for out left to 4.9% of cases where it resulted in yields, and 3.3% turning out right. So we can see that priority for people crossing is much improved when vehicles are turning out of the side road, both for marked and design priority crossings. There's also a difference when we look at a setback. Priority for people crossing is much improved when the setback of the crossing is partial, or there is no setback. So this is looking at all of the sites across the two studies. When there was partial or no setback in 84.6 and 82.2% of cases respectively, there was no yield by the person crossing, compared with 60.3% for full setback. So just in summary, the priority crossings, whether marked or both marked and designed, tend to work better as pedestrian and cycle flows across those junctions increase, as vehicle turning counts into or out of those junctions reduce, as the main road speeds are reduced, and they tend to work better for outward turning movements from the side road compared with inward turning movements. Design priority might be appropriate when the number of crossing movements exceeds the number of turning movements. And finally, the marked priority parallel crossings can be effective when turning movements exceed crossing movements. In terms of the collision data, obviously it was limited at these sites, even when we looked at 5 years before and 5 years afterwards. But emerging data from collisions indicates that priority junctions are no less safe than conventional junctions, and the results for marked priority junctions indicate that there was a statistically significant safety improvement after marked priority was installed as compared with before. These are just a few features that came up as desirable in the focus groups. So in terms of design features on the design priority crossings, it was felt that tactile paving would be counterintuitive, but the engagement with visually impaired people was needed. It was felt that unambiguous and well-maintained road markings, particularly in the main road, was important. And consideration should be taken for the visibility of all users, whether they were cycling or walking across the junctions or turning in or out of those junctions. With regard to marked priority features, it was felt the zebras are the markings that are the most respective, and they give priority without ambiguity. That priority cycle markings reinforced by design, whether it was colour, material and levels, were all important, and then the less the setback, the better. And then in conclusion, good design influences street user behaviour more than markings and regulation. Design priority appears to be more effective in providing priority for people crossing. Marked priority offers better priority than the conventional side road design. Parallel crossings appear to work better than other marked priority designs, and partial and no setback are better than full setback. Thank you.
Jonathan, that's fantastic. Thank you. Fascinating to see the importance of the really specific aspects of highway design in terms of behaviour. I might come back to that in a second. So there's one question in the Q&A from Matthew S, which says design priority T6 and 7 have raised table rank markings. Why do Copenhagen crossings, which are also raised, not have rank markings? Does that question make sense?
Yes, it does, and I think it's interesting what appears in LTN 120. I didn't go into too detail into those different typologies. We looked at the ones that were there, and actually in the LTN 120, the Copenhagen crossings that you referred to on the T6 and T7, the full setback and the partial setback do have raised table symbols, but the illustration for T8 doesn't. I think so that's as it stands in the design guidance at the moment. I think from our findings, actually for design priority, the less the actual removing of the markings altogether is probably reinforces the design and makes the priority stronger. So in some ways, any markings, including the raised table markings, reduce that the design and sort of go back onto markings, and the findings illustrated that design actually gives priority more forcibly than the markings themselves. So it's it is a bit of a conundrum in that the guidance does show it on one of the three, but not on two of the three. But our results suggest that actually removing markings is preferable in design priority.
Great. And then just a question from Ian Kirkellis saying, Jonathan, great to have a copy of your slides to share with colleagues, given the data. Can I just check that's okay with you if we share the slides with delegates? Is that okay?
Yeah, fine. All of that's in the public domain. That's fine.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Okay. And just a question from me. So, I mean, what your presentation highlights is how significant design can be for road user behaviour. How is research like yours then plugged into formal national guidance? Is there a kind of route whereby the outputs of your research then informs future iterations of highway design guidance? How does that work so we can take advantage of your insights?
Yeah, I would say, obviously these things aren't a straight line one to the other, but there are a number of pieces of research that are going on and dialogue going on between them, and these are then feeding into the dialogues on future guidance. The other pieces of research that are going on are the ones relating to zebra crossings at side roads you may be familiar with. The TRL did a trial in Manchester, and now there's something similar being done in Cardiff following that. So we're all in dialogue on these different possibilities for giving priority across junction, alongside the changes in regulation. So there's dialogue happening behind the scenes, but it's not a straight line. We do the research, therefore the guidance changes.
Of course not.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Jonathan, thank you so much indeed. So we've got about 15 minutes left before we're due to finish at 2 o'clock. So I'd just like to sort of invite the other panelists back onto the camera, and obviously encourage people watching the webinar to put any other questions they had to panelists you've already heard. I'd like to start by asking David, Teresa and Nick in that order. So you are sort of thinking about road safety and casualty reduction sort of across the board. So you've got David looking at UK, Teresa looking within Wales, Nick looking within a borough. It's a slightly unfair question to ask you, but if you had a kind of magic wand and you could have whatever mix of legal, physical, financial, policy changes that you could have to really tackle this stubborn level of KSIs, what would you do? David, you mentioned a few things earlier on about implementation of some things that were being recommended. But if you could have whatever you wanted from the political and policy process, what would you have? I'll come to you first, and then Teresa, and then Nick.
I'm like a joined up UK-wide strategy, which draws on the best of what there is. And I think, well, one of the interesting things about the diversity of devolved administrations is that Scotland has reduced the drink drive limit. Wales is pushing ahead with a national 20-mile-an-hour limit on minor roads, and a major review of its major road schemes in terms of their carbon impacts, safety impact, and so forth. But England is incredibly important because it's the bulk of the population, the bulk of the casualties, and there's a lot going on there, which is very good. So I try and pull them all together. And it's actually not that difficult. There's an awful lot of things that could be done. They tick all the right boxes in terms of economics, health in the health service, promoting active travel, all those sort of things. So it is rather frustrating that we haven't done, I would say, low-hanging fruit. This establishment of road safety investigation branch, I think, is going to pull together a lot of very useful data rather than going out investigating every single crash. It certainly won't do that. But I hope it'll become a repository for all the data from the police, DVLA, the local authorities, and so forth. And that's a massive benefit. So, it's hard to put your finger on any one thing. I mean, it's a mixture of traditional things. PACS has really focused on seatbelts over the last couple of years, where everyone thought, oh, job done, what's the issue? We've realised that 30% of people who die in cars are not wearing a seatbelt. So there is still some old-fashioned issues that need dealing with. Drinking and drunk driving is emerging very fast as an issue. And then there's new opportunities and technologies with automated vehicles and even on the road to that. Things like ISA So, you know, there's a lot that could be put together, I think, fairly quickly.
Yeah, and it's a bit like climate change, isn't it? It's not like we don't know what the solutions are. We just need to crack on with with dealing with them and sort of getting them done on the ground at scale. Brilliant, thank you very much. So, Teresa, David mentioned the kind of sort of evolving practice in the devolved administration, Scotland and Wales in particular. What, looking at it from a kind of Welsh road safety partnership point of view, if you had a magic wand in Wales, what would you wave it and get to help tackle your challenges in Wales? We can't hear you. No. No, it looks like you're off.
Yeah. Sorry, my headphones ran out of battery at the last bit of the question. Could you just repeat it for me? I know you want me to discuss the devolved administration, but
well, I was just saying, if you had a magic wand, looking across Wales as a whole, and you could get any mix of policy measures, legal changes, technical changes, what would be your kind of, what would be your ideal package of things that would help you really tackle the remaining KSI issues in Wales? If you could have whatever you wanted from policymakers and funders, what would your ideal mix be?
Well, of course, David is absolutely right, and I think the same applies to the devolved administrations. For me, it's where there's a new road safety framework coming out, which will be November this year. The previous one was target based. When England removed targets, we kept them, and I would like that. But if I had a magic wand, I'd have a blank check, to be honest with you, because we know what we want to do, and I think there are some practical constraints and we can't deliver it. So we've been through austerity. The road safety teams in the highways authorities have been reduced. There's no lack of will to deliver anything, but I think putting those practical measures in, and we used to describe it as cradle to grave education, and it's around that behavioural change, that widespread acceptance that we don't accept death on our roads. It's not something I think that should be an acceptable risk to motorists or vulnerable road users. So I think, you know, our policing colleagues, Dave's absolutely right, drug driving is an issue, but we're constrained in terms of laboratory access. You know, we can only send a certain member off because we won't get them back in time to prosecute them. We've started to have proactive crime teams, so that is going out using intelligence to prevent people before they can become more serious, and that's aligned with National Roads Policing Compliant Vehicle Initiative. So trying to understand, if you're the type of person who doesn't have tax and MOT, are you likely then to go on and cause harm, taking those people off the roads? But, you know, I think it's all important. We've got the 20-mile-an-hour legislation coming in, that's really useful. We've got the Active Travel Act, Wellbeing of Future Generation Act in Wales, and that's all supportive. But I wouldn't, the policies I think will come through. It's about having the checkbook to deliver them, I think, for me. I think you're on mute now, Ben.
Sorry, school child error, thank you. So clearly an issue there about resources after some considerable time of constrained public spending. Yeah, I think that's crucial. And then Nick, from your point of view, from a kind of individual borough, at the kind of receiving end of money, legislation, powers, etc., you mentioned the experimental traffic orders. What would be your kind of ideal mix, magic wand mix of things if you were going to tackle the remaining problem you've got?
I think just twofold from my side, Ben. One is I still think we live in a very outdated set of criteria for speed enforcement, where basically we turn and say someone has to die on the road and then we'll think about doing something. That's literally what our criteria says at times, particularly in relation to things like speed cameras. And I do think we need to evolve with criteria that's more proactive and in advance of things happening on our road. And as we discussed earlier, I think legislation's got to evolve to give local authorities and others like the police, but mainly local authorities, the ability to be able to step forward and support and enhance the rollout of speed enforcement and average speed cameras as well, where appropriate. And I stress that it shouldn't be littered everywhere, but in the right circumstances, have the ability to bring that forward as a tool amongst others to support speed enforcement.
Brilliant. So speed, as many of you have said, a clearly crucial issue in making sure that people are staying within the legal speed limits. So we have a question in the Q&A about the highway code changes that we mentioned at the start of the session. John Carr says, as a pedestrian in London, his perception is that awareness of the highway code changes is limited. Do the panel share the perception, i.e. that although the changes have been made, people aren't necessarily aware of them? And to what extent might they need to be better communicated in order for people to understand then why junction designs might have been changed? David, what's your sense as to the extent to which those quite important changes have actually been conveyed and understood by the travelling public?
Well, it did generate a lot of media interest and social media and all sorts when it happened, and quite a lot of controversy, and I think some sort of deliberate misinterpretation sometimes. People saying, oh, so now a cyclist can ride down the middle of the road, can they, and all the rest of it. So I think it has been observed more than most changes to the highway code, which go unnoticed. But I have to say, what I think is really needed is the kind of stuff that Jonathan presented on. We have to back this up with design, because putting a few lines in the highway code, which is not actually changing the law, it has some force. I think we need to get the designs to be self-explaining. Then it's backed up by the highway code, and then it can be backed up by education. But it is also a complicated message, because on the one hand, we've said there is a hierarchy and some people should take more responsibility than others. But at the same time, they're saying, well, all road users have a responsibility for themselves. And I think that's right, so it's quite a complicated message to convey.
And Jonathan, you began your presentation with the highway code changes. To what extent does it feel like those changes are helping drive changes in thinking about the detail of highway design and how to make that safer for vulnerable road users? Is that kind of coming through in the work you're being asked to do?
It's certainly relevant, and I would agree with David. I think it's that alignment between behaviour, design, and infrastructure is critical, because we've got so much legacy infrastructure that almost goes against our design. So we might have side roads where it's quite possible to turn in at 50 miles an hour, because that's how it's designed, even though it's a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit. Why do we have that kind of thing? So that alignment would be great. And I think in things like the new urban guidance, it tends to align those things, but it's very slow, and we've got a lot of legacy junctions and infrastructure around, so it's not an easy fix. Even if we get our guidance right, it's going to take time, and it does need lots of different initiatives in order to get these sort of our eggs in a row.
Great, thank you. And then perhaps building on that, and perhaps Chris, I'll come to you first. So there's a broader question about sort of how effective, from Peter Gordon, about how effective is traffic calming. Are some methods better than others? And let's take quite a broad view of what we mean. So there's been some controversy around low traffic neighbourhoods, but there are obviously historical debates about speed humps and things like that. From your experience at the local authority level, how useful is traffic calming physical measures, and are there some interventions that are demonstrably more useful than others based on your experience? Nick, sorry, not Chris. I called you Chris. My apologies. Who's Chris?
So what we've done in our boroughs is we produce an annual road safety plan, and within that we talk about the various types of measures that have been applied, different types of traffic calming, different types of effectiveness, and try and collate data around what is and what isn't effective. And also, there are certain elements of traffic calming that can be effective but aren't very popular. So, for example, speed humps can often bring their own issues in terms of noise and vibration and resident complaints, and don't tend to be well supported. We have found that the softer types of traffic enforcement, and by that I mean things like speed indicator devices and vehicle activated signs, tend to bring about a 1 to 2 mile per hour reduction in speeds and not have the same kind of level of dislike from the public in terms of physical impact on the road and changes. And they tend to be the ones that we're rolling out more and more. We've just literally applied for 20 more in the case of Wandsworth, because they are proved to be very popular and reasonably effective.
Brilliant, thank you. And then a question here from Roy. David, perhaps if you could take this one. So Roy points out that new cars seem to be getting bigger and heavier, which obviously has implications for carbon as well as safety. To what extent is this linked to either the incidence of or severity of injuries with pedestrians and cyclists? What do we know about that? And is there anything we could do from a policy point of view in terms of vehicle design standards from a road safety point of view to tackle that issue if it's a problem?
Yes, I think it's a very pertinent issue. If you look to the United States, I hope you're not getting too much background noise. Someone started drilling.
That's fine.
Okay. Yeah, if you look at the United States, more than half the new cars sold are SUVs, you know, these horrendous looking, very aggressively designed, high fronted, square fronted vehicles. And we are importing a bit of that in the UK, not nearly the same extent. So it is a worry. I don't think we have good data at the moment about the impacts of it. What I would say is, first of all, as I mentioned earlier, we would urge the UK to adopt the General Safety Regulation, and to some extent, some of the advanced features of that, things like autonomous emergency braking, can offset design issues in a way, you know, rather than, so they should avoid the collision in the first place. So adopt the GSR, and also encourage adoption of 5-star NCAP safety rated vehicles. So the government now mandates the government fleet has to be 5-star safety rated. So they build in safety ratings which are above and beyond the regulations. And one of the criteria they're moving towards is looking at the impact on other vehicles. You know, so if a big vehicle hits a small vehicle, you know, what's the impact of that? So I think those are things to be promoted, and local authorities, such as Transport for London, you know, could mandate all its vehicles. They get the NHS to do it. All the vehicles to be 5-star safety rated, and that will help. You know.
Brilliant, thank you, Jonathan. There are quite a few questions in the Q&A about quite specific aspects of highway design. I wonder, would it be possible for you to kind of take those questions offline, because there's some very interesting questions there, but which I don't think we're going to have time to deal with in the webinar. Is that possible? Could we do that?
Yeah, could someone send me a copy of that? I tried to start answering, and every time I try to answer, I get kicked out of the call. So I've stopped attempting. Yeah. If I could be sent a copy, I can answer them. That's fine.
Perfect. I'm sure we can. Brilliant. And then Teresa, I'm just going to finish with one final question from me to you. Obviously, you're working at kind of Wales level in a very important partnership across different organisations. I just wonder if you could sort of finally give us a sort of sense of what your experience is in terms of the value of that kind of partnership working, and what the lessons might be for either at local authority level or indeed UK level for that kind of partnership working across local government, central government, the police, NGOs, how that works, and what the key takeaways are for you from that approach.
I think there's obviously efficiencies of scale. So, for example, we've got 22 local authorities, and what we can do is, for example, do a communications package over one campaign. So rather than having 22 little versions, we can have one agency do design concepts and things like that. So initially you have a consistency of message and a consistency of approach. And I think the other thing with having all partners present and engaged is that you play to the strengths when those strengths are needed. So, for example, we run Operation Options. That's a mix of fire and rescue service. The highways authorities will go, and the police. So the police pull someone over for not wearing a seatbelt, and they get the option of a penalty on spot, or the fire and rescue service provide the education. And that's because our research tells us people would rather have an educational input from somebody who works for the fire service than a police officer. So what I think it allows us to do is talk together about things, find the best way of doing things, learn from each other. And I think if you've got somebody like me, and I think council there who said, you know, it's frustrating and is not willing to be to get things done, or maybe even have a trial. I think when you've got a partnership as large as ours, and we do sort of speak to our colleagues in England, myself particularly from the old safety camera partnerships forums, you know, with people like David, Road Safety Support and so on, you're probably going to find someone you can talk into trying something. And then you can just bring that back to the table and say, look, we tried this and this is how it went, you know, and that's exactly how Operation Snap worked for us. You know, we run Community Speed Watch across Wales, so there's one office sending letters. It's so easy then to get a community group set up. The policies are there. My staff train them, so you know, you're not duplicating skill sets, mandated training. You're using a team of specialists for the good of the wider public. And just a note on 20s, and I've got to say, it's taken up a large part of my life for the last 3-4 years. But having that overarching governmental change to say, this is going to change and this is what it looks like, particularly for when we start enforcing where the speed limit is set by streetlights and not by lots of signs everywhere. It gives us that message to say, this is what it is here, and there's no ambiguity. And maybe it's just my simple brain, but I just find a uniform, consistent approach really helpful for the motoring public.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. So I'm afraid to say we're at time. In fact, it's about a minute past 2 o'clock. My apologies for overrunning it so slightly. Can I thank our 4 panelists today, David Davis, Teresa Chiano, Nick O'Donnell and Jonathan Flower, for your really interesting presentations and covering the full gamut of issues from national policy right the way down to junction design. Thank you very much to Ruby Stringer from the TPS for organising today's event, to Brogan McPherson from PTRC for helping with the event logistics. And thank you all very much to all of you for making time over your busy lunch times to attend this really interesting seminar. And we look forward to seeing you at another TPS event not in the not too distant future. Thanks very much for coming and hope you have a good afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.